Welcome to Behind the Balance Sheet, candid conversations with financial leaders, the podcast that takes you deep into the minds of the masters behind the numbers. Join host Chad Dean as he connects with financial leaders as they share their journeys so that we can gain valuable insight from their failures and triumphs. Get ready for candid conversations, behind-the-scenes anecdotes, and practical wisdom that will transform the way you think about your career in finance. Now put down the balance sheet and listen in.
Hello, my name is Chad Dean. I am the host of Behind the Balance Sheet. I'm also the CEO of Integrated Management Resources. Integrated Management is the sponsor of Behind the Balance Sheet. And I've been an executive recruiter for 27 years, based here in Phoenix. And I've spent my life interviewing people. And the purpose of this particular show, Behind the Balance Sheet, is to learn more about Phoenix financial leaders and create a repository for those that are looking for a career in accounting and finance. And I'm very happy to have our guest today, Scott Brogi. And he is the CFO of Open Tech Alliance here in sunny Phoenix. It is very sunny today and very hot. And so welcome, Scott. Nice to have you.
Thanks so much, Chad. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. So let's just begin. We're interviewing you today. We're learning about you. So I just learned something very fascinating right before we went live. And so tell us let's start with that, where you were born and just kind of a little bit about your background.
Sure. Yeah, I was, my father was in the Army. He was a West Point graduate. And so at that point in time in the 60s, he was stationed out in Southeast Asia. So I was actually born on the island of Okinawa, which is kind of a joint military base, still very important to Southeast Asia and Taiwan in particular today. So and kind of grew up in the Army for the first 15 years or so. So, got around to a lot of garden spots and, lived in a few different places. But I've always viewed that military background as a real advantage because I think it gives you a comprehension of what people from different places bring to, meetings and points in time when you connect with them. So I've always seen it as a real advantage, but it was a fun start. And then we kind of settled on the East Coast after my father retired.
And when did he retire?
He retired in the late 70s.
Okay.
And then so he was working for AT&T in New Jersey. And so we settled out there, and that's where I went to high school, and then ultimately college up at Syracuse in kind of the opposite of Phoenix, Arizona, a very chilly spot most of the year. So anyway, I've seen both ends of the range, I guess.
Yeah, we share that in common. I was an Air Force brat. My dad was a pilot. He was stationed actually in Thailand in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And he retired colonel. So we share that military background. And the fact that you moved around quite a bit, had to make new friends all the time.
Absolutely.
That helps you with your social skills, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the military families tend to be in the same boat. So usually somebody shows up with cupcakes or a cake or a pie as you're bringing the trucks off the boxes off the Mayflower van, right? So, yeah, it's a great group of people. And I really thought it was a great way to grow up.
Yeah. So tell us about, you chose finance as your undergrad, but it doesn't sound like you started out that way.
No, not at all. It's funny. It sounds like we have some common background there as well. But I started out actually mechanical engineering at Syracuse and suffered for 3 semesters. I actually transitioned to double E at one point and just didn't turn it. And I was always good at math, right? But sort of tangible math. And as it got more theoretical, I tended to struggle with it more. So at the recommendation of a friend, I tried a couple of business classes my sophomore year at Syracuse, and that really clicked and showed me a path to where I could build a future, and that's how it's all turned out. So that was a real pivot for me, going from engineering to finance, and I think shows that you can make those kinds of changes, and it's important to find something you like and something you really connect with so that you can go deep.
Absolutely. I started out double E. But I was not good at math, and I have no idea why I was trying to become an engineer other than I liked
Right.
figuring out how things worked, and I
Yep.
loved electricity. But Pascal and Fortran were not my forte. So
Right.
I
Right.
ended up
I can relate.
going and I got a degree in biology. At least you're using your background. I'm not using a degree in biology other than in fly fishing, which we can talk about later.
Yeah, I'm
The
looking forward to that.
entomology is important, right? So tell us about, did you make the decision? Was there a choice between finance and accounting, and why did you make the finance choice?
Yeah, I tended to gravitate more towards, kind of the economic side of things, and you know, um, and certainly did a lot of coursework in both. And then, right after college, I had an opportunity to join Chase Manhattan Bank at the time, right now JP Morgan Chase, and they had a really great training program. It was called the Global Credit Training Program. It was a full year, as very deep dive, and took you through sort of all the core elements of accounting, financial statement analysis, tons of modeling. It was to go back. I think it was in Lotus 1, 2, 3 back in those days, but it was really deep and really built one of the things that I still enjoy today, which is modeling, budgeting, kind of putting those pieces together, figuring out what the drivers are going to be for a business from both a top line, a revenue perspective, as well as ultimately what's going to end up on the net income line or the EBITDA line, right? And so being able to go really, really deep in that really kind of hooked me, right in my first year as something I knew I wanted to do. And in the program, you kind of graduate, and then you usually spend a couple years running a pretty traditional corporate banking credit team. That was kind of the process for moving up. And so that was a good experience. I ended up during that process moving down to the Baltimore, Washington area. So Chase had acquired a bank down there, and they wanted to build out kind of a regional corporate finance practice. So went down to that market, ran a credit team for about a year, and was kind of apprenticing with a pretty experienced or very experienced senior banker from the Baltimore, Washington market. So that was great. And then they kind of figured I could, add, and I could like get out and talk to people and not generally embarrass anybody. So they let me progress into what Chase called a relationship manager role. And so, I got to go out, meet with people all over Northern Virginia, DC, Baltimore, and interact with those clients and figure out what they were looking for, and see, how we as an organization could differentiate what a money center bank could bring versus what some of the local banks could bring. And one of the big things was corporate finance and derivatives and those kinds of things. So it was a great opportunity. I mean, I couldn't get anybody out of New York for under $1 billion in revenue. And this is the, early 90s, right? A long time ago. And so, so I got a lot of rope, which was really fun. So I learned a lot. I got to make a lot of connections, and it was a tremendous experience. And that really kind of pulled me more towards the finance side than the accounting side, because it was, you're generating the data, the information, the financial statements, but then really seeing very early on how CFOs, controllers, VP finances would use that to accomplish the things they needed to accomplish for, large privates, even a few smaller publics, NASDAQ traded companies that were in the area, really showed me at a very early age what that outcome could be, right? And that's what I really connected with, was, what are you going to do with those numbers? How are you going to take them? So I think there's a lot of value to each, but I do think they are two very different things. I think you see a lot of CFOs, because I know that's where we're going to end up, who have a classic accounting background and CPA, and I think that's very valuable. And then you see other CFOs that, tend to be a little more about the strategic side or the capital raising side. And I think they do tend to be very different, right? So for me, I like the latter, and I think it's because I started seeing how organizations would use those things and how they would position for capital and how they would look ahead a couple of years down the road. So that was a great start for me, a great opportunity, and I'll always be thankful for it. So I think it shows that it's important to find a place where you can learn early on and get a tangible sense after college of, what you really want to do when you grow up.
But it seemed like it gave you exposure to a lot of different industries.
For sure.
And it was definitely, I'm sure, did you work pretty hard first couple of years?
Yeah. I mean, it's what happens in, accounting, certainly in the legal side, right? You're putting in your hours and I was driving all over Southern Maryland, Northern Virginia, DC. So in the car a lot, doing a lot of meetings. So yeah, they were long days, but they were really good ones.
Yeah. So then you decided to go to B school from there?
Yeah. So I'd spent about 5.5, 6 years at Chase. Great progression. Had kind of stepped up into an officer role. But, at that point in time, I kind of realized that I didn't want to work for a really big organization my whole life. And it's funny to look back because I think Chase Manhattan, when I left, had like 42,000 employees, which seemed like a huge number when you're like, 27. But I mean, they're massive today, right? With all the consolidation. So it was a good time for me. I came out west, got into UCLA. So did packed the van up, spent one last summer on Cape Cod, and then drove the van across country and showed up in Los Angeles. And, that was really a great experience for me. Because of my work background at Chase, I was able to waive out of a lot of the core classes, right? So statistics, other things like that were, pretty foundational. I was able to waive out of those and then get into some advanced classes really early, and then also do a fair amount of internships, which I think have a lot of value as well, because it continues to take you down that path of, well, maybe I think it's going to be like this, but here's what it's really like in the real world, right? So that was really valuable, but got to TA some great classes early on. One gentleman who won Business Week's Graduate Teacher of the Year a couple times, fantastic corporate finance professor, Bill Cockrum. Got to TA that class, and that was a lot of fun because I was it's a 2-year program. I was still a first year, and I was getting to TA. It was like the capstone class for the second year, so I got to have a little fun with the second year marketing students. So that was a lot of fun. But had a really good blend, had a fabulous experience, and then after business school, had a couple opportunities, but really wanted to kind of build out my Rolodex in LA, to use an old phrase. Because I'd never lived on the West Coast before, so I wanted to do that. So I joined an investment bank out there, and got into a number of sort of valuations a lot early initially, and then ultimately doing M&A, and that's ended up being a really big shop. Houlihan Lokey, one of the top 3. We were much smaller back in the mid to late 90s when I was there, but they did a fabulous job of building that business, and it was a good experience. But then I ended up getting recruited out by a CEO that I'd actually done an internship for when I was at Anderson at UCLA, and he was in the healthcare industry, and he had kind of this crazy idea in 1997 about aging in place, right? And so we kind of put a business plan together and went out and raised about $7 million in venture capital from a firm down at Del Mar, and kind of then it was off to the races. That's what I've done for the last 25 years.
So I'm going to back up a second.
Sure.
Because you chose MBA, entrepreneurial finance, as opposed to maybe a pure, is that equivalent to a finance master's, would you say?
Yeah.
With just a slight business tinge to it?
Right. Yeah. And it was interesting because I forgot to mention, while I was with Chase in Baltimore, Washington area, I actually wanted to take a class in, I think it was like portfolio theory. It was something that was more like investment related, right? And I'm working at the bank, and I wanted to do that, but to to take a class, you actually had to apply to their graduate program, right? And this is Loyola College in Maryland. So I did that. And again, this was kind of the first time that I was able to wave out of a few things, right? So got in, completed that program. But I think that was another thing that reinforced that I wanted to go more in the direction of, what are you going to do with the data? How's that impactful for the organization? And then looking down the road a bit and saying, from a capital perspective, what's it going to take to get to whatever the goal is for the organization, right? So, we want to get to X dollars in revenue, or we want to get to a certain EBITDA level and have a transaction, or we've got a couple founders who are ready to, call it quits and move on. So, I think it's all about aligning with what's that ultimate goal for the organization.
How about the network you built at UCLA? Still there today?
Absolutely.
Tight group?
I've still got a lot of friends. I still go bike riding with a couple of my classmates. No, it's a great group. And now it's funny to see people, what are we? Almost 30 years down the road from graduation. A lot of people are really at senior roles at companies. So it does give you that network where, when you're trying to connect some dots to get someplace, that you can have a good conversation with somebody who's going to, steer you straight. So ton of value in that network effect that you get coming out of graduate school, for sure. So no, it was a great time. Had a lot of good years at the beach in LA, and still have a lot of great friends from the program.
You mentioned internships and how important they are.
Yeah.
And they really are that important. When I'm looking at a resume and I see somebody coming straight out of school, I want to see what internships they had. Have they tasted the real world?
Yep.
Did they taste the real world of what we want them to eventually do?
Right.
And so did you end up getting picked up by one of the interns? Did you intern with Houlihan Lokey?
So I didn't intern with them, but I did a few sort of capital related internships while I was there. So some of it between first and second year, typically you'd have kind of a summer job, right? And so I worked for a investment management firm up in Pasadena, and that was good. But then instead of classes, you could also take internships, and then you would kind of submit a report at the end about what you did. So because I'd waived out of a few core classes, I had some extra credits where I had more flexibility. And UCLA was really great at that point in time in terms of encouraging people to, again, go out in the real world and see what it's going to be like, which I agree with you completely is hugely valuable. And so I had a chance to do that. And one of them was a healthcare company. It was like an infusion therapy company, if I remember correctly. And then the CEO was a real visionary. He now runs a healthcare related kind of venture fund still in the Los Angeles area, but really sharp guy, and kind of the rare combination of could see far down the road, but then was also really engaged on executing. And so he saw something in 1997, 1998 that I think people are really just starting to execute on now. So I saw a quote when I walked into the office here. It was a Steve Jobs quote. It's one of my all-time favorites. But it was that where it was almost like he could see the future, right? Like, and for him, it was just, wow, this makes complete sense. Why wouldn't we do this tomorrow, right? Like the world needs this tomorrow. And the concept was aging in place, as I think I mentioned. And so, and I think you certainly see it here in Phoenix a lot because we have a, very robust senior community here, but a lot of people would much rather stay in their own home as opposed to going into institutional care, whether it's assisted living or whatever it is. And so the idea was to bring caregivers into the home to allow people to stay in the home that they're comfortable in longer, right? And so it was a great idea. And the other part that was important is he saw the change that the internet was going to have for the senior population, right? And so the internet was just kind of starting to blow up as I was coming to the end of business school. It was an area I was very interested in. And so he thought the senior community would get engaged there more quickly. Now, if you look at what's going on here in 2023, it's hugely important for the senior community, and they can do so much of what they need to do on the internet, and it keeps them very independent. So, Joe was right. He was just about, 20 years early. So we had a good run there. We did a roll up when I ended up leaving Houlihan and joining Joe for that. And, we rolled together a number of home care companies, but it was really a great experience going out, seeing the full circle of, raising the capital, putting the business plan together, raising the capital, and then executing and going out and rolling up 8 or 9 businesses in the first 18 months to jumpstart the revenue, and kind of seeing that whole thing come to fulfillment, and then, build a big business out. I mean, that business is still around today. I think they do a couple $100 million a year in revenue. And it's getting close to what Joe had envisioned in 1997. So
I'll tell you what, I can't see beyond the end of my nose half the time. And I'm so impressed by visionaries and
right.
people that have that skill. I don't know if that's a learned skill or if it's a natural skill. I wish I had a little bit more of it, but that's great that you got to work with somebody like that. So I want to go back to, you're at Houlihan Lokey. You have the CEO asking you to leave.
Right.
Go to industry. So everybody talks about, I want to go to industry, but a lot of them don't. They stick around, they become partner, they make a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's just
I probably should have, because they ended up getting bought out by a Korean firm, and everybody who was there, did really, really well. So anyway, we'll see how that one ultimately pays out or not.
Right.
But I probably had a little more fun.
But making that choice, was that difficult for you? Was it, this is the next step in my career, I need to do this? Because there's a lot of people that are sitting right now in public accounting, and they're sitting there going, well, should I go to industry? Should I not? Did you ever have a regret? Tell me about that thought process at the time. Or was it a no-brainer? I'm ready to go.
Yeah, no, it wasn't quite a no-brainer. I think I'd been there 2.5 years. And again, at that point in time, Houlihan was more valuation focused, 409A valuations for companies, doing that on a regular basis, as opposed to, say, the M&A side, which is, a little more variable and has a little more excitement to it, maybe, to use a word, right? So it was kind of a good time, because I'd been there for a couple of years. I'd learned the basics of valuation, and I mean, I still apply that stuff today. We just did a valuation for my current firm a quarter or two ago, and then did a stock buyback based on that. So, that foundational knowledge, having that right grounding to understand what the important levers are, is incredibly valuable all through your career. But it wasn't, I certainly struggled with it. Had I known they were going to get bought out a couple of years later and everybody was going to do great, it probably would have made the decision harder. Right. But, never really any regrets, because very quickly I was able to get into, trying to take a real concept to market. Right. So we went and raised capital on that plan, moved into, it was funny, because when we raised the capital from the venture firm, one of their partners had like a partial interest in a wine bar in Dana Point, California. Right. Which is a great town. And so I'd be commuting down from Los Angeles, which was approximately 52 miles, if I remember correctly. And so we actually, the partner said, well, while we're getting everything started, you guys can we've got some extra storage space in the back of this wine bar, so you guys can make that like your founder office, right? So there were like 5 or 6 of us in there. And, so it was, not quite a garage, but it was pretty clear. It was like actually probably worse than a garage, right?
How about happy hour every day, huh?
But we could walk around the corner. So that was a nice feature, certainly. And then after we got some traction and we acquired, we started to deploy the capital, acquire some businesses, then, we needed to start executing on a lot more. And we had a lot of staff. So then we, moved into some bigger space, and it's been off to the races for 25 years there ever since. So.
Yeah. So tell me, when was the first thought that came into your head that I would like to be a CFO?
Yeah, I think it was probably there. The company was called Accent Care. It was actually the name of the organization, still around. And so I was kind of the founder. Joe and I were kind of leading corporate development, right, which is really just acquisitions. We were out doing this roll up, and then they brought in a very experienced, great CFO, female CFO, actually. This is the late 90s, Janet. And so I was able to see kind of the leadership that, she brought to the CFO role. Right. And so I think that's one of the things that really attracted me, because you had your hands on a lot more elements of the business. Right. So, CFO can be in charge of, not just sort of the accounting, financial reporting, FP&A side, but, you can touch certainly operations. You have a ton of oversight over spending and budget. Technology is a piece that information technology will often report into the CFO as well. So, I was doing the M&A on the front side, bringing those businesses in. But then in many ways, we're kind of handing the business off to the operating elements, right? And so it did feel a little bit isolated after doing it for a couple of years. And, I had a desire to kind of have my fingers in more pieces of the pie. So I think it was probably then that, I first said, that's probably kind of the direction I want to head towards longer term. So yeah.
How long did it take you to get there?
It took me about 7 years. So I joined another after a couple years of M&A. They were going to slow down their acquisition pace a little bit, so it wasn't going to be as exciting. Plus the 52-mile drive each way wasn't,
which is 150 in LA, right?
Yeah, right. It's like 1,000 in LA. Yeah, right. Anywhere else. So it was a good time for me, and so I ended up connecting, and this is where that network we were talking about at Anderson was so great, because I always stayed close. They have a entrepreneurial studies center at UCLA that's traditionally in the top 5 in the country, so it's even more recognized than, say, the graduate program in total. Fantastic program. They get students into all kinds of opportunities. And so I'd always stayed very close with the gentleman who ran that organization and the person who helped him do that. And so she told me, yeah, there's a couple Anderson grads a couple years after me, and they've got this idea in photography, right? And I had recently gotten married, and the founder of this business, he and his wife had recently gotten married, and basically the concept was, how weddings used to work a few years ago was you would shoot it with a film camera, right? So because this is
film, what's that?
This is 2000. This is going way back, right? Shoot it with film, and then you would create this proof book, right? And then, if you've got family from outside of where you are, you have to send this proof book around so everybody can see what's going on and see how great they look, right? And then they would order off it, and all that back end stuff is like the last thing that professional photographers want to do, right? They're very creative, very artistic. They love the event, but they kind of hate everything after it, right? So the original idea was to digitize from film and then post that up to the internet, and then actually print off the digital file, which you could only do to a certain size back in 23 years ago. But it was a really cool idea, right? And it was literally in the town that I lived in. So, ditch the 104-mile commute and do it in your backyard, and true raw startup, right? So all right, let's push this a little further. Let's really see how this looks. So I started off running business development there, right? So it wasn't just in the core piece, because it was pre-revenue. There was There was nothing to count, right? Like, so we had to go make something to count first. And so
You pulled back your chase days, right? Going out and meeting
right,
clients.
exactly. Right. So I had that core skill that I developed. And so I had a ton of fun, didn't really know much about professional photography, which is the other thing I liked. I don't know, what part of my background tends to make me like to parachute into situations where I have no idea what's going to happen, but it's there. Right. So so we did it. And then, over about a 6-year period, kind of met everybody, including my wife. My wife was actually a professional photographer from St. Louis. And we had kind of a core group of ambassadors. There were 2 guys, one in LA, one in Atlanta, who were like the 2 top wedding photographers. One of them had shot all the Kennedy weddings, right? And these guys were awesome.
Wow.
So we would travel around and do these, dog and pony shows all over the country. But there was a group of about 50, we called them ambassadors, who were great friends of these 2 photographers, Gary Fong and Dennis Reggie. And, so we built a really tight group, and we would go to the conference, and it was a big, good time. So built just fantastic friends from that business. And we ended up taking it from no revenue to over 5,000 professional photographers. And about 2 years into the period, the interesting was a business changed completely, because Fuji came out with the first good digital SLR, right? And Kodak had cameras way ahead of that, but they just couldn't get it mobile, essentially, right? And so so photographers started to convert from film to digital in 2001, 2002, and the market swung completely. It went from 95% film in 2000 when we started to 95% digital by 2002. So we had to pivot the model, charge differently, because we used to get paid for each scan that we would make, right? And wedding photography, like the rapport you have to build with the clientele to convince them to send their film that they can't replace from a wedding to some crazy little lab in Hermosa Beach, California, to get it scanned and then put it up on the web and produce. Like, that was a reach, right? And so that's why it was so critical that we had ambassadors that they trusted, who were saying, I've tried it. It's a really great service. So it was a great run, right? And we ended up building that to, north of 40 million in revenue, and ended up a few years in getting a large private equity firm interested in the business. And we started off looking to recap it, and they ended up deciding they wanted to buy it. So it was a great experience. We stepped through angel fundraising, right? Some friends and family money first. So having done the traditional VC route first, then seeing friends and family, leading to kind of a Southern California has a really well-developed angel network, right? So go in to raise some capital there, and then you keep building and getting some partnerships that, with Kodak in particular, that contribute a lot of the equipment that we needed. So we kind of, very much bootstrapped it, right, and fit the pieces together, but ended up creating a lot of value for the friends and family and the people that were in early. So, another great experience. But I wasn't the CFO there, right? So we had another gentleman who's another UCLA grad. He was in a little earlier than I was. So I ran kind of the sales and BD part, grew it to get some business. He was running the finance part. And then towards the end, he ended up moving on to do something else. And I picked up the finance role. But then I had to actually accept my next position to get the official title CFO.
So what was your title at the photography? VP
God,
of finance?
I was thinking I was VP business development, and there were no SVPs. It was just like VP and the CEO. And then it became like something incredibly long, like VP finance and business development. So it was something like that, right? So
how could you fit all that on a business card?
You really couldn't, right? So that's when I stopped carrying
back.
business cards. Yeah.
So tell me, you get the CFO title.
Yeah. And so I didn't get it at that company, Pictage. But after, after the transaction closed and we got that all done, I took a little time, and then, specifically ended up accepting a role with a small public company, NASDAQ traded company right in LA. who had a great CEO, and I had the CFO title. And the great thing about that, I didn't really think about, honestly, having the CFO title, right, in that trend, like, oh, I got to go get something that has the CFO title. It was more about getting the experience with public company reporting, right? So, and this is 2006, 2007 now. And so that was the opportunity because they were a SEC reporting entity, but very small, right, in a tough market. But I wanted to get that experience, right? And so it was a very small team, had to do most of the K's and Q's ourselves. They just had released the iPhone. I'm a big Apple fan, so I can remember submitting my first Q on my iPhone to the SEC, that was kind of bleeding edge in 2007,
Sure.
right? So we had some fun with that. But, I learned a lot about the pieces. I learned, again, how to do it on a shoestring, right? So we had a lot of fun. So I did that for a couple of years, but I was, first officially CFO at InfoSearch Media. So
how'd you get that job? How'd you get connected with the CEO?
yeah, it was a recruiter in LA. Like I said, I took a little time off after the photography company, and so I was just looking at some different things, and the recruiter said, "Hey, there's a really interesting CEO that I'd like you to meet, and he needs to bring in a new CFO to try and kind of restart things." So I went out, and it was supposed to be an interview, but it ended up in like a 2.5-hour whiteboard session with me and the CEO. And we were just like, well, I guess we better make this permanent, right? So anyway, so it was good. Learned a lot from him for sure. And then got that public company reporting experience at a very, granular level, right? So like saw all the pieces that you have to have. And I don't know, just how I was raised, I like to understand. I like to be able to do something myself so that when I clone it and hand it off, I know exactly what's in there and nobody can blow smoke, right?
But tell me, how do you convince the CEO
Yeah,
of a publicly traded company
right.
to take you that has no public experience, no
Yeah.
SEC reporting experience, and hand you the CFO title? How does that happen? Do you remember?
Yeah, it was that whiteboard session, right? Because we clicked immediately. And again, it was getting into that conversation of where are we going a couple steps down the road, right? So it wasn't, we certainly covered the technical aspects of the requirements, right? But it was more about where are we going to go? And look, it was a really small public company. So, I mean, it was public, but it wasn't a big operation. So it was, like a perfect learning experience for me. Cause again, you had to get in the weeds on this one because you just couldn't afford to have some, massive staff doing everything. So you had to do a lot of it yourself. And I think it's hard to run a public company that lean these days just because the regulatory environment has made it much more complicated, right? So there's just a burden on there that makes it very difficult to do it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of a point in time. It was a great opportunity for me. I got the experience and I got that title. And then, that then has been the arc of the last 15 years.
Has it been public ever since?
The company?
The companies. So have your CFO titles all been with publicly
No,
traded companies?
No, that's a great question, actually, Chad. So I have bounced back and forth a little bit. I think it's one of those grass is always greener things because I think any CFO that you talk to, a public company CFO, like at some point in time, quarterly financial reporting becomes the bane of your existence, right? So, there's access to capital, right? And there's investor relations, and there's some other things that you're not going to have in a private company experience, which can be fun, but they can also be incredibly frustrating, right? So I think there tends to be ebbs and flows, right? So if I think of that, started as CFO for a public company in 2007, have worked for, a couple big public companies since then where I wasn't the CFO. So, much bigger organization, reported to the CFO. And then I've been at smaller privates, where more recently, I would say it's stabilized into the CFO position since 2015, basically. So the last 8 years. I did. I joined, and that's when I first actually got introduced to Phoenix. I worked for Apollo Education, um, which is the parent company was parent company for University of Phoenix. And so I actually got pulled in there by the gentleman that was the CEO at the first public company I was CFO at, right? So we had each gone and done something separate. And then he called me in 2010 and say, hey, there's this really interesting thing. And again, we'd always enjoyed our collaboration, right? And that was really fun because although we weren't in the top seats, we were in very influential seats. And so we were able to push for some things that we think needed to be changed. So we got to do some really fun stuff there. I worked right over, I actually, on the way here this morning, I drove past my old office. It was right on Priest and the 202. So right over by Tempe. I think there's like a Port of Subs across the street still. So I might hit that for lunch afterwards.
There you go.
So we were running a teacher continuing education business there, which was, a nice $50 million-ish business. And then we convinced the leadership that they needed to get more into leadership development for basically the Fortune 200. So really big companies. So we convinced them to let us go. And this is when, University of Phoenix was having some troubles on the regulatory front. And we said, hey, you really need to diversify it. A lot of people want shorter duration programming. They want, hey, 6 certificate courses that are going to allow them to get a bigger IT job, right? Or the teachers want to get a higher job within the educational infrastructure. So it started there. And I think you're seeing that again, everything takes longer, right? Like that's the biggest thing I've learned is you can have these great ideas, but generally it's not going to happen overnight, right? I think there've been some things that have happened really fast. The internet has changed that speed, but most things take a while. So we got to roll that program out. Took a couple years to build it. We had to do all the technology behind it, web, take it to AWS, do all those pieces. But again, I've always enjoyed having my fingers in a few different fires and not just being the bean counter, right? So that was a tremendous experience. We did that actually up in San Francisco. So for about 3 years, we lived at LA the whole time, right? We lived at the beach in LA. So like 1 week I'd fly to Phoenix and we'd do the teacher continuing education business. And then the next week I'd fly to San Francisco and we build out this new professional development program, right? For corporate America. And Apollo was the holding company for University of Phoenix. And they had about 600 people in San Francisco doing mostly technology and marketing, right? And back then, University of Phoenix was actually, I think, the largest marketer on Google. So the annual marketing spend was like $300 million a year. It was a massive spend. They took University of Phoenix to a lot of San Francisco Giant games. I remember. I don't think I ever went to one. But so it was a great run and a lot of different experiences. And then ultimately, it wasn't going the direction that I thought we needed to invest more into that programming, and they were just running into difficult capital situations. So anyway,
that's a whole nother story, isn't it?
It is.
It's a whole nother podcast. So tell me about, obviously with CFO role, there's leadership involved.
Mm-hmm.
Do you consider yourself a natural leader? Talk to me about your growth within leadership itself.
Yeah, I think the thing I've really learned over the last 25 years in particular is that, a team is a much better way to solve it than an individual. But I think there's some caps on that. Like I think smaller teams tend to be able to execute more rapidly and more precisely than large teams. And I just think that's sort of kind of where I started. My father was special forces after going to West Point, and that's what I saw in action when I was born in Okinawa, right? Well, a couple years later. But so I think that has it orients how you think about the future, right? Because you see how things get done in that setting, right? And I think there's a lot of a lot of connections to how things get done in business, right? And so that's always been a really strong, uh, had a really strong impact on how I approach things. Um, and so as you go through the arc of your career, you see places where it kind of moves from being doing things yourself, right? So you're an analyst at Chase, right? And you're doing this stuff, but it's very tactical. And then over the arc of your career, you're moving towards how do you find the right people to fill in the different things that the organization needs to accomplish whatever the goal is, right? And I think that's one of the places where you see that arc of a career where you're moving from the doer role. I mean, I've heard the puppeteer role is kind of one that gets thrown around a lot these days. So I don't know if it's that, but it's more like, all right, I can kind of see maybe where this is going. There's some things we're going to need to continue that arc and continue that development. So that's what I've really enjoyed over the past is you do move from the doing to the orchestrating over that point in time.
What would you
So
consider your leadership style?
I'm pretty direct, right? And I think that just kind of stems from how I started.
And the military,
Right.
especially West Point.
Inseparable, right? Yeah, but I really enjoy kind of handing the reins off more these days and not trying to do everything yourself and try and bring that team along to do whatever the task is, right? I work for I'm sure we'll get onto it, but I work for a company in Phoenix now. There's very much about that, right? Like it's how do we anticipate where our clients want to go, and then how do we make sure we have the right resources there? So more and more of your time starts to come into that sort of table setting, right? For what's coming down the road and make sure you're positioned correctly.
Well, and working with a visionary, I'm sure help
Yeah.
you see around corners that maybe
Right.
a lot of people can't. So I like this question. What and you referenced it before. What would you go back and tell your younger self?
Yeah. It's funny when you're in the middle of it, right? Like it's hard to understand that there's kind of a longer course, right? And everything seems so critical in the moment. Um, so I mean, I think it's important to do things that you enjoy and really feel passionate about. Um, if you're not excited by something, it's going to be really hard to fake it. Um, so I always tended to migrate towards things that I really enjoyed doing it. And early on, the M&A stuff was really exciting. So would definitely kind of focus on that, and then that becomes kind of a means to an end, right? And as you get a little older, you see a few more things and you say, hey, there's a lot of ways to grow a business, right? And so, I want to play in that more broadly than, just doing M&A deals, right? Which is definitely a path I could have gone down. But I think it's a mix, right? So there's some organic growth. What do you need to do to nurture that internally? There's some external things that you can do. So I think, part of it's dictated by the situation, what industry you're in, what kind of growth arc is in front of you there, and then what's the best way to execute against that. So to me, these are always like chess pieces, right? That you can deploy in different ways based on the situation that you see in front of you. And so I really enjoy that part of it now. So you kind of move from tactical to a little more strategic over that arc, but certainly you have to have the right foundation to understand what those different moves look like and what it's going to give you, and then what some of the risks and the setbacks will be, right? So with my current organization, we have a really strong market position, and we can be really strategic about where the next move is, right? So it's nice to be in a position like that where you can really think about, all right, where's the industry going? What's not working so well right now? And what's going to be the best way to get to whatever the goal is. And I think that's one of the things I've really seen over the last 25 years is, look, you're always going to have to adjust your plan for whatever's happening on the field, but you do need to have a plan, and then you do need to be able to be flexible enough to adjust based on what's happening out there. And that's the part I probably enjoy the most, right? Like making those changes and saying, all right, here's where we are, here's where we want to get to.
Well, you're fortunate because a lot of CFOs are just fighting fires all day long. So
yeah, right.
You have that,
right,
that
right.
opportunity. So this is kind of how we're going to wrap this up. But,
Mhm.
and you touched on it a little bit. So, and the question is, what advice would you give to someone just starting out, either early on in their career or that wants to achieve the CFO title? And I think you kind of touched on it a little bit, and it's interesting because another guest I had on here also worked for Houlihan Lokey.
Oh yeah.
Also was in investment banking,
Mhm.
and then went into restructuring as opposed to
Yep.
M&A.
Right.
But did a lot of different things to try and figure out maybe what their likes are, but
Right.
just be open to it. So what advice would you give?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to sample a few different things, right? So I started off on very traditional footing with Chase for almost 6 years, right? So very traditional credit, those pieces, and then sort of figured it out, right? And then kind of adjusted where I wanted to be, and then it was a good time to go back to school, right? So they wouldn't take me at Stanford, so I had to go to UCLA. So I did that, had a tremendous experience. It's a great program, still very connected to it. So Anderson was the perfect place for me. And then then you come out and you've been exposed to more things. So I think if you're going to go down this path, I'm a big fan of getting the MBA or the MS program in there at some point in time, depending on what you want to do, because I think it does sort of broaden your field of vision on what's out there. And then I spent a couple years. So I did sort of traditional banking, B school, and then a couple years in investment banking with Houlihan Lokey, and that was great because it showed me some of the traditional valuation pieces, and then got me into some of the M&A stuff, and then I basically got recruited out of there by somebody I'd worked for while I was in business school, having that pedigree of Houlihan behind you then, and I think a pretty broad sense of what was out there, right? So you definitely have to try different things, find out what your affinity is with, right? And then move in that direction. And then as I moved into the corporate world, again, it was kind of M&A, initially, and then it broadened into more of like a corporate role where you've got different departments kind of reporting in. And then that's been the path really of the last 25 years is you continue to have more things under you, but it's really important, I think, to have a broad sense of what the field looks like, not be so super linear. And I know we have a tendency to do that these days, right? So I would just encourage people to try and broaden their experience set so they can come at opportunities from different directions. Because as you look at my last 15 years, different pieces have been more important. Some places like debt was incredibly important, right? Others were public companies, so we had to go out and do secondary offerings, right? So I think the more you can have in your tool bag, how to adapt to a situation, and it's more likely you're going to be able to respond effectively.
And network.
And network. Always be networking, right?
Every guest that I have had on talks about how important the network is.
Right.
So I think we really hit on a network is important, getting a lot of different experiences, the internships and everything. So
absolutely.
I can't believe how fast time flies, but we're coming to the end here. And I mean, we could go on for another couple hours because I know you got a lot of information, a lot of knowledge to share. But I do appreciate you being here today and sharing that knowledge. And if if somebody wants to reach out to you, how would they get a hold of you?
Yeah, I think, I've been a huge LinkedIn fan from the very beginning. So that's a great place. I'm pretty easy to spot there. So, you can track me down there. And, we've moved from Los Angeles to Phoenix in the last couple of years and are really loving it out here. So I'd worked out here for a couple of years, so it made that transition easier, but we're having a great time. And I love to help people as much as I can, as well as continue to grow this exciting business I'm with now. So
Fantastic. I too can also be reached on. You can look me up on Google, Chad Dean, Integrated Management. I hope I'm number one on there that comes up. I also too am a big user, addicted to LinkedIn,
right.
For better or worse. And so that's it. We're going to wrap this show. And thank you very much, Scott, for your time today. And look forward to talking with you more after this.
Likewise.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Behind the Balance Sheet, Candid Conversations with Financial Leaders. We encourage you to apply the knowledge and wisdom shared in these conversations to your own career. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to our podcast and leave a review. Your feedback is important to us as we continue to bring you more candid conversations and thought-provoking insights from successful financial leaders.